It's no big secret that challenge rating isn't the most accurate gauge of a creature's capabilities. Horror stories abound of high-level parties murdered by low CR creatures such as shadows and intellect devourers, and many a DM has been unpleasantly surprised with how easily a high CR creature went down to their players. Fixing challenge rating or CR is a bit too broad of a topic for a single video, but there is one lie in particular that CR tells you that contributes a great deal to how inaccurate it is. Hey everybody, and welcome to Arcran's Arcanum. I'm Arcran, and today we're talking about challenge rating, or more specifically, a small detail of challenge rating that makes it a bit less accurate than we would like. Let's get started. To start things off, let's define what challenge rating or CR is. Simply put, challenge rating is an approximate gauge of how difficult to fight a creature is. As a general rule, a party of 4 at a specific level should expect an encounter against a creature of equivalent CR to be about medium difficulty. As an example, a party of 4 level 3 characters should expect to win an encounter against a CR3 creature without having to expend too many of their resources. A creature's challenge rating is primarily determined by taking the average of their offensive CR and defensive CR, which are approximate measures of a creature's offensive and defensive capabilities. Offensive CR is based on the total damage that a creature does. It is determined by looking at the average damage that a creature is expected to do in a round and comparing it to the offensive CR table. This will correspond with an expected attack bonus, and for every 2 points that a creature's attack bonus differs from the expected attack bonus, adjust that creature's offensive CR up or down accordingly. If a creature primarily uses saving throw based abilities, instead reference the expected save DC and adjust in a similar manner. This is very simple to calculate when a creature's damage primarily comes from single target attacks, but in the case of area of effects or recharge abilities, it gets a little more complicated. In the case of area attacks, try to estimate how many creatures it should be able to target simultaneously with that area of effect, and multiply the average damage by the number of creatures it's expected to hit. For creatures with inconsistent damage, such as those with recharge abilities or spell slots, simply take the average of how much damage the creature is expected to do over the course of the first 3 rounds of combat. Defensive CR is calculated in a similar way. You take a creature's hit points and refer to the defensive CR table. This will provide you with an expected armor class, and for every 2 points your creature differs from that expected armor class, adjust their CR up or down accordingly. With a short summary of what challenge rating means and how to calculate it under our belt, let's move on to a practical example. Let's calculate a werewolf's challenge rating, starting with its offensive CR. Its claws are its strongest weapon with an average damage of 7, and it makes 2 attacks for a total of 14 damage per round. If we look at the table, this corresponds with an offensive CR of 1. That expects an attack bonus of +3, which is within 2 of the werewolf's +4, so no further adjustment is needed. Defensively, the werewolf has 58 HP, which corresponds with a defensive CR of 1/2. That expects an AC of 13, which is within 2 of the werewolf's 12, so no further adjustment needed. If we average the werewolf's offensive CR of 1 and defensive CR of 1/2, that gives us a total CR of 1, which is not what the werewolf is listed at. A werewolf is challenge rating 3, so where does that big gap come from? The answer comes from a special trait that a werewolf has: immunity to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage from non-magical, non-silvered weapons. This is an incredibly powerful ability at low levels, and the defensive CR equation accounts for it, as shown by the table on screen now. This takes the form of adjusting the effective number of hit points the creature has for the purpose of determining their defensive CR. Depending on the ballpark challenge rating of the creature, resistance and immunity to non-magical damage is weighted differently, from having no impact on their defensive challenge rating at high levels to effectively doubling their hit points at lower levels. As the werewolf is a low-leveled creature, this means that we treat its hit points as effectively twice its value for the purpose of defensive CR, which gives us a defensive CR of 4 and a total CR of 2.5, which we round to 3. Now, if we look at the table again, this non-magical resistance is weighted very highly at low levels, but is still a considerable part of a creature's defensive CR in the level 5 to 10 range. In my experience, I've found that typically characters that rely on a weapon for damage have access to a magical one by level 6 at the absolute latest. Spellcasters are obviously easily able to avoid resistance to non-magical damage, which means that from level 6 to level 10, a considerable portion of a creature's defensive CR is completely ignored and useless. This is how challenge rating lies to you and results in creatures that look challenge rating appropriate going down extremely easy to an appropriately leveled party because they have half to 2/3 of the hit points that the challenge rating equation expects them to possess. Now, after that lengthy introduction to challenge rating and how it lies to you, let's talk about how we can fix this. As a quick note, you only really need this fix if your party has ready access to magical weapons and magical damage. If you are playing in a low magic game where your party doesn't have access to magical weapons in the level 6 to 10 range, you don't really need this fix, but I still encourage you to check out some of the fixes as they provide some more interesting options to spice up monsters than the simple resistance to non-magical damage. Our first fix is the simplest. Simply increase a creature's hit points. Their defensive CR is incorrect due to a massively inflated hit point pool due to their resistance to non-magical damage, so simply bringing their hit points in line with what the equation expects will, in theory, make them challenge rating appropriate. Returning to our werewolf example, it has half as many hit points as expected due to its immunity to non-magical, non-silvered weapons. If we double its hit points for a total of 116, we correct the CR equation and bring its hit points more in line with what is expected. This isn't a particularly interesting or engaging fix, but it's effective and it's great for simple creatures that don't really have a clear-cut weakness. Our remaining fixes move away from the binary and boring magical damage bypasses all resistance and immunity, and instead replaces it with specific vulnerabilities that players need to take advantage of or else face a much more difficult encounter. In addition to how much the non-magical damage resistance skews the CR equation, it also doesn't really cause any interesting choices in combat. A player's best weapon is most likely to be their magical weapon that they're going to be using anyways, so there is no extra element of choice created by these resistances. If we instead require specific damage types or exotic materials, we have a new way to make our encounters more tactically engaging and reward our players' preparation. These systems also will allow players to brute force through encounters even without the appropriate weakness, but they will face a much more difficult encounter if they do so. This makes exploiting the weakness feel more like a reward for preparation as opposed to a barrier to entry, which I've found is more enjoyable for players and is a much better game feel than the alternative. Our first fix steals from some basic monsters, specifically the troll and the zombie. In particular, we're using modified versions of the Troll's regeneration ability, which allows it to heal rapidly unless it has taken fire or acid damage, and the zombie's Undead Fortitude, which allows the zombie to make a Constitution saving throw to stay standing when it would be killed, unless the damage was radiant or a critical hit. Both of these abilities make an encounter much more difficult if the party isn't able to make use of the appropriate type of damage, but doesn't require that the entire party is constantly using that type of damage. Defensive CR already has guidelines for regeneration, so our modified Troll's regeneration ability is simple to implement. When calculating a monster's hit points, simply add triple the amount they regenerate each round to their effective number of hit points. The goal here is to provide enough regeneration to replace the creature's effective hit point bump provided by resistance to non-magical damage. Going back to our werewolf, it's receiving effectively 58 hit points from its immunity to non-magical damage, so we're going to want it to regenerate 20 hit points a turn. This regeneration is disabled if the werewolf has taken any damage from a silvered weapon since its last turn. 20 hit points around is a significant hurdle for a low-level party, and is certainly going to encourage that they find some way to deal damage with a silvered weapon. Do note that this regeneration does not include the Troll's ability to regenerate itself back to consciousness. That's a fun toy that we're just going to save for trolls and other similar creatures. Replicating the zombie's Undead Fortitude is pretty simple as well. Whenever our werewolf would be reduced to 0 hit points, they need to make a saving throw with a DC equal to the damage taken. If they succeed, they instead drop to 1 hit point. If the damage was dealt by a silver weapon or critical hit, the werewolf automatically fails the saving throw. I would use the creature's strongest saving throw among Dexterity, Constitution, and Wisdom for this ability, so Constitution in the case of our werewolf, and also note that this ability is a bit stronger than the zombies version. If you're using the enemy as fodder, I'd increase the DC to 5 plus the damage taken, but keep it as the flat damage value if it's a solo or boss encounter. This ability also encourages the party to make use of silvered weaponry, but also provides some value for classes that are known for dealing a lot of damage in a single attack, such as rogues, as they'll have a much higher saving throw than someone that deals damage through smaller attacks. The last thing we need to do is come up with a fun name for this ability. I've chosen Supernatural Resilience just to show off how tough these creatures really are. Something similar to this can be ported to a great number of creatures that currently have resistance or immunity to non-magical damage. You'll always want to choose some kind of weakness that your players can use to get past this ability. In the case of a werewolf, a very obvious physical weakness to silver is the simplest choice. Ghosts, banshees, and other undead might instead have this ability negated by radiant damage, whereas a creature that simply has a great deal of resilience and regeneration might just have this disabled by being under the effect of the poisoned status affliction. This is a fix that will make a creature's weakness feel meaningful while also addressing a significant failing of the challenge rating system. Having access to the right weapon or damage is going to make the encounter a bit easier, but it's a lot more interesting than simply requiring a magical weapon. This will also likely make your encounters a bit more tactically engaging, as the monsters are likely to prioritize whatever player character is able to capitalize on their weakness. This means the rest of the party is going to have to come together and find a way to defend that character and allow them to continue to exploit that weakness. I would also suggest that you still slightly increase a creature's hit points even while using this method, probably by about half of the expected hit point bump that they would have gotten from their non-magical weapon resistance. This simply helps to make sure that the creature isn't a pushover if the party is able to make use of its specific weakness, but it still ensures that the majority of a creature's defensive power is coming from this specific supernatural resilience ability. As a quick note, be careful using this with hard to exploit or secret weaknesses unless you want to frustrate your party. If your party is going to need an adamantium weapon to bypass a specific creature, make sure that they both have access to adamantium weapons and some way to learn of that creature's specific weakness, whether that be a helpful NPC or simply an Arcana roll in the combat. The challenge of these weaknesses should be forcing the party to prepare and change their tactics, not read the mind of the DM for what weaknesses they'll need to exploit on the next adventure. Our final option to correct this failing of CR is my personal favorite, but is also the most difficult to balance. Our other options have focused on increasing a creature's defensive CR, but defensive capabilities don't typically make for interesting encounters. Terrifying offensive capabilities that put the party right at the edge of death, though, those do make fun encounters. Essentially, what we want to do here is determine a creature's CR if we remove their non-magical resistance, increase their defensive CR a little bit, and make up the difference with an offensive CR bump that can be disabled through some easily exploitable means. Let's look at the Fire Elemental as an example. It's a challenge rating 5 creature with an offensive CR of 4 and defensive CR of 5. If we remove its non-magical resistance, the defensive CR drops to 3, so let's increase its HP a little bit to 120 to bring that defensive CR up to a more comfortable 4. Now we need to increase its offensive CR to 5 or 6 to get it back to a CR 5 creature. We're going to aim for the higher end of 6 simply because this is an impermanent boost that can be turned off by the appropriate damage type. If we consult our chart, we need to get to about 40 damage a round, or about 15 more than we are currently dealing. To accomplish this, we're going to add a new ability to the Fire Elemental called Overwhelming Flames. This will make the Fire Elemental deal an additional d10 of damage from its Fire Form ability, and an additional d6 of damage with its touch attacks. If the Fire Elemental takes at least 10 points of cold damage or any damage from its water susceptibility trait, this is disabled until the end of its next turn. This is a big bump in the Fire Elemental's damage output, but if the party has access to cold damage or water, they should be able to easily disable it. Adding a damaging aura or increasing the damage of attacks is the simplest way to accomplish this offensive CR boost, but a similar thing can be accomplished by providing a creature additional attacks unless it is damaged by a specific material, or giving it access to a powerful ability such as an area of effect breath attack that is disabled if they take the appropriate type of damage. We could have just as easily allowed our fire elemental to cast the Burning Hand spell as a bonus action unless it took cold damage or had its water susceptibility trait triggered, but we went with a flat damage boost just to keep things simple. There's a wide variety of ways to make creatures more powerful, and hopefully these tweaks have given you some ideas on how you can modify monsters to get around the mismatch between what the challenge rating equation expects and what the resistance to non-magical damage does. Before we wrap things up, let's talk about why, even after making these changes, you might want to keep a creature's resistance to non-magical weapons. The answer is a simple one. In most towns or cities, there's going to be guards that, while not individually powerful, a large number of can defeat most creatures in the monster manual. Because of this, it can be helpful to keep similar abilities on these creatures simply as a barrier to entry to explain why normal people can't handle the problem. A resistance to non-magical damage isn't going to hinder your players after a certain point, but is an excellent explanation for why these great heroes have to deal with a problem. Simply ignore it for the purpose of the challenge rating equation and instead treat it like a narrative ability that's essentially gatekeeping what is capable of dealing with a specific threat. And with that, we're done. Hopefully you have some fun ideas on how to make some monsters more difficult and engaging while removing a deceptive and boring part of most creatures' stat blocks. I've linked a challenge rating calculator down in the description that removes a lot of the table lookup from this process and streamlines things considerably. In addition, if you want a bit more information about challenge rating, I've linked a video down in the description that goes into that in a bit more depth and also talks about how to build out a full adventuring day. Beyond that, if you have any questions or an example of a fun ability you replaced a creature's non-magical resistance with, please let me know in the comments. Otherwise, thanks for stopping by the Arcanum and have a great day.